This is BreakPoint This Week, a weekly briefing on faith, culture, worldview, and mission with John Stonestreet, president of the Carlson Center for Christian Worldview.
Welcome to BreakPoint This Week. I'm Shane Morris here with John Stonestreet again to talk about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. And John, here we are in week 2, I think, I've lost count, of this pandemic that's edged pretty much everything else out of the news cycle, including last week, Joe Biden becoming the presumptive Democratic nominee for president. And it's also probably the most time I think Americans have spent at home in decades. I know my kids have now actually run out of Magic School Bus episodes on Netflix, and they're having to cycle back through and watch them again.
Yeah, the crisis looks different for all of us, doesn't it? I saw my daughters have been watching the Jimmy Fallon monologues, which he's doing from his home, filmed by his wife with his kids interrupting. And I think this week he started by saying, we're on day 83 of the lockdown. And she said, honey, it's day 6. He goes, really? It really seems like day 83. You know, honestly, at the same time, I've talked to a lot of people, and I would put myself in this category of the unexpected blessings of, first of all, we've had a week of weather here in Colorado Springs, and I want to show gratitude for those things, right? Because we have a yard. We even got sunburn this week in Colorado in March, and it's like got some good sunburn, not like
on their faces
Florida.
Because of reflected snow, but still.
But they almost look like Florida kids. But you know, this time together, I talked to a number of our ministry partners and friends, personal friends at the Carlson Center, who just talked about how God was, blessing their families. We had a wonderful week, in a sense, too, with over 7,000 people that signed up and took the short course that we offered, which was just kind of like, look, you have time on your hands. Let's use it to think clearly about what's happening in our world from a Christian worldview. And that's something that we're going to continue next week, and we'll talk more about. But I guess I want to point out those blessings, right? Because gratitude, as G.K. Chesterton said, is the queen of all the virtues. And Chuck Colson used to like to repeat that one because he believed that this thankfulness. Dr. Glenn Sunshine posted a tremendous article on our website this week, and we'll link to it if you come to breakpoint.org. But he was kind of walking through the numbers of past pandemics, and the numbers are absolutely staggering.
Right.
We're nowhere in that ballpark, and we're also talking about a world that was hit that was far less populated than ours. But we have an amazing amount of medical knowledge. We have an amazing ability to carry on our lives. The unemployment claims were staggering this week. And yet, how many people are still able to work from home? And that wouldn't have been the case just 10, 15 years ago. So there's things that I think Christians should be thankful for, and we should continue to be thankful for. And that should drive us with mercy and grace and help for those who need it.
Yeah, the perspective is so crucial, John. And the conversation I had with Dr. Sunshine on the podcast recently is we talked, among other things, about that very issue, the fatalities during things like the Black Plague, and how, close to half of Europe succumbed to this. And comparatively, we're dealing with something that's a lot less severe. I mean, that doesn't change the fact that there are millions of people now without jobs. It doesn't change the fact that, as the New York Times reported yesterday, hospitals there in New York are at their straining point. They're filling up to the point now where they're having to keep bodies in refrigerated trucks and try to expand out into conference centers. And we don't know where we are in the curve. So we could be seeing the beginning of our medical system overwhelmed. But yeah, perspective, gratitude, togetherness, and supporting one another, reminding each other of our blessings, that's crucial. Otherwise, the alternative is the kind of panic that we've been warned about and wary of. And I think that's exactly the right reaction.
Yeah, I mean, we are facing, I think, a challenge of discernment. We've been doing a series on BreakPoint called Worldview Lessons from the Coronavirus, and we'll link the first several of them. But one of the ones that's up and coming is this, and the importance of discernment, something that we talked about on the program, I think, last week. And look, we're at the point right now where there's the numbers that are exploding. We were told it was going to happen as the testing got out, and yet also that doesn't explain the significant amount of ER visits. But the temptation is for people to punt to their narratives. Unfortunately, it's almost always a political narrative. Trump's screwing this up, or Trump's not making any mistakes. And then, whatever else goes along with that. I guess I was struck here, Shane, here as we were talking is, for years I've worked with Christian school teachers and Christian schools who were, committed to this idea of biblical integration. And the question they always were like, well, what does worldview have to do with math? And here, this is what worldview has to do with math, right now. Because, first of all, the need to recognize that we have worldviews and that they're going to affect our interpretation of the data is kind of step number one. It's the gentleman, this is a football, step in this. But the second thing, too, is just even what we were talking about, this interesting and important tension that Christians live in that we cannot rid ourselves of. And that is this gratefulness that the sheer numbers that we saw in times past are not going to translate into today. And yet, sheer compassion and heartbreak because every single person's made in the image of God. And most other systems don't have the capacity to hold together the one and the many, the inherent priceless value of every single person that's sick, even if it's a millennial that was partying on the beach in, Florida just last week, still is made in the image and likeness of God. Even someone who's elderly and has a quote-unquote pre-existing condition and is unlikely to survive, their death is still a tragedy and their life is still of infinite value. And yet we can also be grateful for the technological advancement. And, it's kind of strange, but in a sense, this is a Christian worldview of math. It's a math of numbers when you apply it to valuable image bearers.
It is. And then you have the issue of, controlling the outbreak of coronavirus and the numbers that apply to that. And there are moral questions bound up in that, just like you said, when you understand, what an exponential curve looks like, what it looks like when a medical system is overwhelmed, as in Italy, you realize the importance of the kinds of measures that have been put in place throughout the country, the social distancing. What we're trying to do here is to keep things from getting to the point where they're teetering on in New York, where hospitals are overwhelmed. And just by slowing down the spread of the disease, we can save lives. We can prevent those deaths that with ventilators and with basic nursing care can be prevented. So, yeah, there's that. And then there's the economic angle of it, how we have to balance. We have to come to a really difficult decision in terms of the economic cost we're willing to accept in order to save lives. And there's been this really just raging debate online, especially in Christian circles in the last week about, the justification for closing down an economy, putting people out of work, closing down churches even. There have been articles exchanged with quite harsh words on both sides about, the merits of closing churches and of moving services online. And I know my church this past Sunday, John, did an online service, and it wasn't the same thing. It definitely wasn't. And we have this theology of embodied worship that we should be getting together as the body to partake of the body of Christ, to hear the word proclaimed in person and to praise God as a church together. That's irreplaceable. We're embodied beings. And yet, during a time of crisis like this, Puritans like Richard Baxter in his directory had very good advice about it. They said if the civil magistrate determines that there's a pestilence, a disease like this, or a dire threat to the populace, then Christians should obey their directives to stay home from public worship and do the best they can to sort of make up for that in family worship. And today we have, thankfully, technology that allows us to meet remotely and to enjoy some of the components of that still, and to keep one another prayerful and thankful and remind one another to praise God. And so, yeah, it's just a time of tough decisions right now. And it goes so far beyond just pure number crunching.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this as well. What I see as two very big culture-wide decisions that confront you at a time of a pandemic like this, and why we can't just punt to non-Christian thinking on this. The first you brought up is this economic challenge. And of course, we're talking about a vast United States. We're looking at hospitals in New York facing a situation that hospitals in Nashville or in Oklahoma City or in Colorado are not. Now, could we? Absolutely. Is that a possibility? You bet. There was some interesting and just heartbreaking language that came out of a hospital in Detroit. And I thank our colleague Ashley Cowles for pointing this out. A Detroit County hospital just basically putting in place, if we get to the point where we've got to ration medical supplies, here's how we're going to do it. And I think the rationale wasn't Christianly thought out. I'll say that up front.
Yeah.
But
and
to their credit, they were saying
about this.
Well, we did. Yeah, we did. And this question isn't going away. And we'll link to that BreakPoint, just how do we think about these things. To their credit, they responded with, look, this is stuff we hope we never have to do, but we need to have it ready in place. And of course, all of us are doing contingency plans kind of across the board. But look, I had conversations this week, Shane, that really brought this to light personally. Talk about kind of the one and the many. The culture-wide decisions can't overlook the sacred individuals. On one hand, dear friend of mine from an older generation, who was in the military, went to war, is a real thinker, was talking about, these times in World War II where, kids were signing up 13, 14, 15 years old, lying about their age, and recruiters accepting their lies because they needed the numbers. And they get on these transport ships with this plan to, invade Japan, and 70%, he said the pep talk was 70% of you aren't coming back. That was the pep talk. But this mentality that we will do this because it's for the good of the many. Now, that's a voluntary thing, and we rightly acknowledge some of that as heroism and kind of the greatest generation. And now this individual who shared this story and these thoughts with me as we were having this conversation, he himself was one of those compromised individuals, had a heck of a year health-wise, and if he catches it, it's bad, bad, bad news. And he was basically responding to some of the spring breakers in Florida who were saying, well, it's not going to affect me sort of thing, and, just the unwillingness to do that. On the other hand, some of our dear friends in our community, a refugee family from Burundi, already fled genocide. Burundi and was basically a country where the genocide of Rwanda spilled over when these individuals were young. They have a young family, 2 kids and 1 on the way, and she was just laid off, works at a very nice hotel here that laid off all their workers and closed down to Memorial Day. It's a Memorial Day. Listen, I mean, they're a 2-income minimum wage family, and they don't speak English, and they're here legally, having fled from persecution, and they've done it as right as they can. And making a decision based on a scenario in New York and Colorado Springs is a very difficult thing to do. And I think actually the hotel did the right thing closing. I think they did the wrong thing in what they did to their employees. So I'm looking at both of these, and this is, the president's using language that, the cure can't be worse than the disease. I get that. And yet at the same time, the calculations here have to be based on human dignity. I guess I'm saying all that to say this is a really, really, really difficult situation. The other challenge, and I'll try to keep this short, is the trade-off that people always make between safety and freedom. Mm-hmm. That is an unavoidable trade-off. I was talking about this on my World and Everything in It segment on Friday. I mean, look, if your memory just goes back 20 years to 9/11, you can see the trade-off between freedom and security. I mean, because of 9/11, the entire country has given up their right to not face illegal search and seizure every time that they fly by a bureaucratic organization that is bad at its job and that is held completely unaccountable by any government force. I mean, that's now in place. That's now the normal when you travel through the airport. I know I always look for opportunities to point out the evils of TSA, and I'm doing it now, right?
There's been a single episode in the past year so far where you haven't brought up TSA at one point or another.
You get it. But look, I mean, now I think the questions that people are raising have to do then with, look, if we so quickly lost that freedom, now what are the freedoms? And we know, I mean, you and I are both, conservative enough on the political spectrum to know that government doesn't give up territory it gains, without quite a struggle. Right. And I think that's one of the concerns here. But at the same time, look, if the choice is, the sacred lives of people and their health, then you make that choice. And I guess I want to say that these are really, really hard decisions, and we have to think about them with the right framework. The BreakPoint we did this week, by the way, Shane, was based on that, which is, look, these are hard enough questions as they are. They become really hard questions in a cultural setting in which we already trivialize human dignity on so many levels and treat people as expendable.
Well, you're listening to BreakPoint this week. Come to breakpoint.org for links to all the stories and news items we've talked about today on the program. We'll be right back. We're going to take a quick break. Stay with us.
We invite you to visit breakpoint.org, and while you're at our website, be sure to browse our online Colson Center store of books and other resources, and you can find links to our social media sites like Facebook and Twitter.
We're back on BreakPoint this week. Folks, come to breakpoint.org for links to all the stories we've talked about today on the program. John, I want to get to a couple of stories that have come to us out of China and then pivot briefly to a story domestically here about the evils that are hiding in the midst of this epidemic. With China, we've got a couple of reports here, one from Fox News quoting Voice of the Martyrs, and they talk about how in the midst of a pandemic, an outbreak that began there in Wuhan, China is cracking down even harder on Christians. There's a report of one church that's being demolished by officials in Jiangsu province. Another edict that's been handed down in Shandong province actually forbids online services, which is how many of us, received the word this past week. And it's just a sort of nonsensical move to further the end of crushing Christianity when the Chinese government's priority should be to put it mildly, elsewhere. And then we have a report out of Salon, or an opinion piece rather, out of Salon that sort of just rehearses China's dereliction of duty and malfeasance in the midst of this pandemic. So not only did they lock up whistleblowers and doctors who were trying to say initially this is a big deal, some of whom died, by the way, but in the midst of it, China kept a tight lid on this whole thing until it was too late, until it started spreading into the rest of the world. So we're just now beginning to learn about all this, John. But there's stuff going on domestically too that's similarly disappointing, I think. And there's evil hiding in the midst of this pandemic.
Yeah, I want to take issue with a word that you used earlier, which in your description here, which is nonsensical. I think that's the wrong word. I think the right word is certainly outrageous and shocking and so on. But no, this is very sensical. This is very Chinese. And we also need to point out that China has used this opportunity to advance its agenda of suppression of religion and advance of persecution, not only to Christians, but also to Muslim Uyghurs who have been a target of this. And there's two things behind this, Shane. The first thing is setting themselves up as the new model for fighting the coronavirus. Nobody in the Western world, except maybe MSNBC, believes that, right? Nobody does. But they have a stability problem, and they've had this stability problem for a while. We know that how many times have we talked about the Hong Kong protest prior to this pandemic, and they're not going away. This is the message that they're giving. Look how we're handling it versus everyone else. But nobody else in the world, I think, is going to buy that, and I hope that the rest of the world holds China responsible for this. The other thing, though, that they've got as part of this stability issue is, they were using this pandemic not only to shut down churches, not only to close out any sort of Christian messages on the internet, but they were using it also when people were praying in the streets or offering to pray in the streets. Why? Because, look, there's nothing higher than the Chinese government. And this worldview, this communist worldview, and this nationalist communist worldview literally sees this as a threat to national power. And what have we seen here in the United States, Shane? What do you see at times like this? Many people suddenly become open to a higher power, become open to the power of prayer. I saw that this week where a very popular blogger put on a request saying, look, I've got a friend in New York. She's in ICU. Please pray for her. And the number of people who said, I don't pray, but I'm praying, or I haven't prayed in decades, but I'm praying. You just read through that, and that's just one story out of many. That's a real threat to the Chinese regime. That's what we have to see. That is a real threat to the Chinese regime. Look, this is horrific. It's unconscionable. The Chinese government would use this as an opportunity to advance their agenda, but I don't think it's correct to say it's nonsensical. It makes perfect sense in their worldview, and this is why, of course, worldview matters. Speaking of, in the category of it makes perfect sense in the worldview and something that's unconscionable, we've also seen during this pandemic in the United States, as we have seen New York City, in the state of New York, warn about diminishing medical supplies, just basic things like gloves and masks and things like that. That one place that these things are being used, as Lila Rose from Live Action pointed out, is in the abortion clinics that are still running. And we have seen Planned Parenthood show its true colors as if we don't know what those true colors are.
I think we saw those colors on the top of one of the New York skyscrapers last year.
Yeah, we did see that. That's exactly right. But, look, while non-essential medical procedures are being stopped and non-essential medical centers, pregnancy care centers, for example, have been closed, abortion clinics have not in many places. And somehow that's essential. In a time when we're trying to save lives, taking lives is considered an essential medical service. This is a stunning grasp.
Well, going back to the China story, John, for a moment, I spoke actually this week with our Wilberforce nominee, Bob Fu, who is president and founder of China Aid. And his story is just incredible. He fled from China decades ago with his wife. After being in prison for 2 months, they went to Hong Kong. They got out on the last day of the previous government there in Hong Kong before the turnover. And then he comes to the United States and founds China Aid, which is one of the strongest voices looking back at China and sort of exposing the abuses that take place there, the human rights abuses, the political repression, the persecution of religious minorities. And I don't know. I don't know how to answer a question like, why does something like this happen? Why is God allowing a pandemic to sweep the world that's going to claim hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives? But I can say that in the midst of that, there are things that come out of it, beautiful, powerful blessings, works by God's people, like China Aid, like Bob Fu, that enable us to see the light of Christ and enable us to see the gospel and his work in the midst of it. And that's something I just come back to over and over again. I don't know that we should or can give an answer to the question of why God allows suffering. When you go back to Job, you see the answer God gives is not an explanation as to why he allowed Job to suffer. Instead, he takes him on a tour of his sovereignty and shows him his power and glory, and then Job repents in dust and ashes. And that's a hard saying. But I think the other side of that is Christ, because Jesus prays, why are you allowing this to happen to me? He prays for God to let the cup pass from him, and yet he still endures that for the joy set before him, and comes through it and creates this blessing for all of mankind. And I think we have to look at the redemption. We have to look at the light, look at the resurrection, and that's the biggest part of the answer to questions like this.
Yeah, this is a hard one, and I agree that there's not kind of a fully solved problem. But I do want to say a couple things. One is that as we're seeing China trying to keep people from looking upward for answers and for hope, that's an opportunity for Christians in America. I mean, this is a conversation point. And the good news is there's been an awful lot of people that have wrestled with this question throughout the years, and they've done it kind of really, really well. This past week at the Gospel Coalition, Tim Keller gave a session on what resources do various religions have when it comes to responding to our anxiety and our suffering. And there are things that can be said that are really helpful. First of all, the idea that we actually sense this as unjust, or we sense this as wrong, or this isn't the way that it should be, says an awful lot about the sort of world that we live in, that we don't live in a world of chaotic randomness where evil and good are on the same kind of par as being accidental consequences of an accidental universe. It points to a moral order that we sense and that we demand, to make sense of our lives. Second, there's a real truth out of the story of Job, and I really appreciated how Tim Keller talked about that in his session this week, and we'll link to that, by the way, if you come to BreakPoint.org. If you go to Eastern religions, this idea of kind of karmic justice, that you are experiencing in this life what you earned in the last life. There's no fighting this. This is that demands your resignation to the way that the world is. Christianity actually says that the world is good, but the way that we experience it now is not the way that it should be. And that we hold some moral guilt into that, and sometimes it's just broken. But it actually gives you grounding and
the resources to deal with it, and then it affirms your intuition that this isn't the way it's supposed to be. Because the answer Eastern religions give to evil is what evil?
Yeah,
it's
what
just
evil?
It's just an illusion. You need to give up your desires. World. Christianity says evil is real. You're absolutely darn tootin' right about that, and there's an answer for it. And his name is Jesus.
And you brought up the issue of Job, and this was the thing that Tim Keller brought out, and that is, look, Job spends most of that book asking really hard questions of God. And while God doesn't necessarily answer his questions, he doesn't condemn his questioning either.
Right.
And he said, that one of the points he made is that Christianity gives you a grounding to pray, but also to think. Not pray in a happy, clappy, your best life now sort of nonsense, but to actually pray, wrestling with it. God, where are you? Why are you? I mean, look at the Psalms. They give you an awful lot of ground to basically ask those really hard questions. Every other Psalm is, David or the sons of Korah or Moses going, God, what the heck? Where have you been? The other thing, though, too, and this is the ultimate place that Christianity leaves us, and there's more to be said, and we'll link to some resources here. In fact, in the coming days, Bill Brown, who's the dean of our Colson Fellows program, is going to be wrestling with this question on a Facebook Live session, and we'll keep you informed about that if you come to BreakPoint.org. It's interesting that this is all happening around the time of the Passion and Resurrection during the season of Lent. And that gives us other resources because, even monotheistic religions that offer kind of a sovereign God that is over the affairs of men and the evil that exists in the world and controlling what happens, either in a determinative sort of way, as we see in many ways that Islam approaches this question, to a completely kind of hands-off sort of way, that some, I think, semi-heretical understandings of, the Judeo-Christian framework offer. Christianity gives you ultimately this resource of the person of Jesus Christ, that it is God himself who doesn't stay aloof from our suffering, but actually enters our suffering and has entered our suffering and actually gets us beyond the suffering through the resurrection. but is a God who's in control, but a pierced God, a wounded God. And maybe, Shane, a good place to close here is with a wonderful poem that I come back to over and over and over. I'm thankful for a pastor in Alabama who pointed me to a poem by a theologian named Edward Shalito, who was actually trying to make sense of World War I. The whole poem is worth it. It's called Jesus of the Scars. And again, we'll link to this too if you come to breakpoint.org. But the closing anthem is, "The other gods were strong, but thou wast weak. They rode, but thou didst stumble to a throne. And to our wounds only God's wounds can speak. And not a God has wounds but Christ alone." And you compare this, it doesn't answer why this evil is happening to me or why this evil is happening, in the year 2020 in America, and also around the world. But it does give us something to hold on to that nothing else does, which is the beauty of the suffering Christ, who is the victorious Christ. And that's something that nothing else gives us.
Amen. Folks, thanks so much for listening to Breakpoint this week. You can visit our site at breakpoint.org for links to all the resources that we mentioned today here on the program. Please stay safe, stay well, keep praying, keep praising, and try not to go through all your Magic School Bus episodes in one sitting with your kids. For the Carlson Center and for John Stonestreet, I'm Shane Morris. Thanks so much for listening.